Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. Your host, Erik Davis, here again, pursuing the quest for holding conversations about consciousness. I'm continuing to focus on upping my game here with the audio. I just had a nice lesson the other day. And since the sound on this show used to be notoriously bad, I shouldn't be admitting these negative things. You know, in today's media environment, you're supposed to, always be perfectly self-realized. That's how you get the brand going. But alas, when you got someone with my kind of personality around, you're going to get a different story. But I, after all these years, have been inching my way up, and have, over the last few years, the long-term listeners will have recognized a distinct improvement. We're keeping on it, though. We're going to get to, I don't want to say perfection, because I don't trust perfection, and I think people can get way too fastidious about technology and hyper-production. That's one of the bad sides of having all these great tools, is now everybody has to professionalize everything up to the wazoo, which is not my aim. Very recently, just a week ago or so, I took part in the Bioneers Conference, the annual Bioneers Conference that happens out here in Marin County, and I've been going to Bioneers off and on for a very long time. I think I was at not the first one, but the second or third, when it was back in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and so it's been fascinating to see it evolve. It's a place I go to feel restored and rejuvenated. You walk onto the site, and already, like, my heart opens up a little bit. The people are smiling. There's a sense of possibility. Which is, of course, increasingly rare these days, and the devotion to the engineering, if you will, of a more ecologically sustained, socially just world is a thriving vision at Bioneers. And this year I went, got my free ticket for being the host of a panel on festival culture, something I've written about a lot, I've studied a lot, I've been to a fair amount of festivals, though I'm no obsessive. And the panel went excellent. It was a great time. All of the people who spoke were full of juice and energy, and it was a wonderful crowd. It felt like a little mini festival in the otherwise alienating and banal hotel room, and I felt particularly blessed because one of the elders of the Vibe showed up, the great legendary Fantuzzi, who's one of those characters, at least in my experience, I run into in all the most perfectly bizarre places, including many of my festival experiences at Rainbow Gathering and a lot of other events as well, Earth Dance and such. And it was a great honor to have him there. And it was also a great honor to hear the presentation by our guest today, Nicholas Powers, a New Yorker who I first encountered in a wonderful article that appeared in the Maps Bulletin and was based on a talk that Nick gave at the Horizons Conference called Black Masks, Rainbow Bodies, Psychedelics, and Race. And this is a conversation that is now starting to really get legs as it needs to, and yet it's a very weird one, and I think has been handled not particularly well among a number of people within the psychedelic community. I wouldn't place Nick squarely in the center of that because he spans a lot of activities. I've been reading his book lately, The Ground Below Zero. 9/11 to Burning Man, New Orleans to Darfur, Haiti to Occupy Wall Street. And since Nick serves as a journalist as well as a poet, as well as a professor of English, he covers a lot of ground and really drawing a lot of links between different sectors and zones of contemporary society. So on the one hand, he's a tried and true burner. On the other hand, he throws himself into very challenging journalistic situations, flying to Port-au-Prince after the Haitian earthquake, going down to New Orleans to see the ravages of Katrina. heading off to Chad, sleeping in homeless shelters, and he brings through all of this his discussions. It was very fresh to read, because while a lot of his political concerns are things that many people are talking about these days, issues of race, issues of social justice, issues of economic domination, problems with the the hippie scene and the narcissism of the new age. He does it in a very rich way that's very accessible, informal, almost humble, except he's also a wonderful writer, so there's a lot of poetry and kind of unexpected moves. It's like a journalist who's willing to acknowledge that he's doing what he's doing for personal reasons, and he doesn't know what they are a lot of the time, and he's as confused and in pain as a lot of us are elsewise, which is something you don't often see with the appear through the mask of journalism as some kind of objective thing or some kind of hard-hitting, very opinionated position. And I'm growing increasingly tired with just how much discourse these days is issued around political issues, in particular, with a sense of declaiming, of knowing, of arguing, of being in the position who sees. And I find that increasingly toxic and hypocritical. So it was wonderful to read Nick's political reflections, and he continues to be a journalist and do political journalism because it has all these other layers in it, things that I recognize. It's like, oh wait, I could drop acid with this guy on the playa. I could also talk to him about the history of race in America. I could also see him at an Occupy protest and being very aware of the complexities of all of these spaces. So I'm really happy to have him on the show. So welcome to Expanding Mind, Nick.
Thank you so much. It was such a beautiful and handsome, glowing introduction. I was like, who is that guy? I would like to meet him. So thank you. Thank you very, very much. And also, I deeply appreciate you taking the time to read the book, because it's almost like a diary entry that's been published.
Yeah, well, that's part of what I like about it. I mean, you mix up articles that you publish with the Village Voice and Independent and other places with these sort of fragments that are more journal-like. And again, I just like to even ask you about that. Is that again, I just find myself like a lot of people reading so many political pieces now. These kind of short, partly journalistic, partly sort of political essay kind of pieces. Examining all the myriad facets of our contemporary crisis. But I start to get dull and kind of disbelieving. I become alienated from the lack of psychological depth and playfulness and, frankly, poetry in a lot of this writing. And after a while, I can't take it anymore. But you really approached it from the get-go in a different way, where there was this personal element, and you were calling out sacred cows. You're with leftists who, in many ways, you agree with their positions, but they're pulling some very familiar moves, and you're going to call them out, and da-da-da. So it's a very multifaceted approach. Was that just natural to you, or did you kind of work your way into your way of doing personal journalism? And
the natural force pushing my writing beyond standard journalism into this kind of confessional realm of writing was really when I came to New York in August 2001, and then September 2001 happened. And so when the towers fell, there was this physical earthquake that went through New York, but there was also a kind of emotional and spiritual earthquake. And we were all kind of rattling inside of our bodies. And so when I wrote, I needed to write beyond the facts to the feelings, because the feelings were bursting out of my body and onto the page. And it was a way of kind of recreating myself on the page after my life had been fractured in the street. So the page was kind of like my hospital bed and recovery room. It was my surgery room. It was my laboratory. It was the place where I could put myself back together. After the beginning of the war on terror for 9/11 in the street. So that was a natural part of it. But I think happened to be by chance in a very a specific intellectual crossroads at the Graduate Center because I was going into a PhD for English. So I was reading lots of literature as well as literary theory. And so I came across critic after critic who was very skeptical of the genres that authors were using to tell their story. That sometimes authors were using a genre to hide themselves as much as to tell about themselves. And so one last thing I'll say on that was that one who was really particularly helpful to me, and he's a person who I always adore. His name is Roland Barthes. He's a French critic and writer. And, you know, he wasn't as big as Foucault, Michel Foucault, or Jacques Derrida or Lacan, but he was up there. He was one of the luminaries of the 60s, 70s kind of intellectual revolution in France. And in writing Below Zero, he had this exquisite passage because he said that the trouble with political language is that too often it's like a kind of contract and a manifesto of ideas that are already prearranged and pre-written and pre-cooked and preset. And what the writer does along is that they just repeat the script. And then at the end, like a contract, they just sign their name. And he goes, what's missing is not the earnestness of the position that they're taking, but we don't know the life history, the transformation of emotion that led them to want to be a communist or a socialist or a fascist or a reactionary or an explorer. You know, we don't know why they take that political position. What is the autobiography that led to the manifesto? We just have the manifesto. And so, you know, that struck me as like, yeah, that's too often people regurgitate, recite, recycle microwave rhetoric, but they don't often say, what is my life history, trajectory that led me to believe this? And that, I think, is what resonates with the reader, not just, you know, regurgitating political idiom.
Yeah, I mean, and even more than just resonating, like it allows for a richer kind of writing and allows people to come from more different angles to enter into the discussion. But I think it's also balancing out, again, a tendency now, which is that the scripts are more and more dominant. Like everywhere you turn, there's a script. And, you know, for me, as someone who's spent a lot of time, you know, around New York media, I wrote for, you know, New York magazines. I knew people who wrote for the Times. I was part of that kind of milieu when I was a journalist. I've always read that, you know, mainstream media along with more radical positions, but, you know, I'm like, whatever, the Times or the New Yorker is all, you know, I'm part of that zone. But like, I think like a lot of people, especially recently as things are getting weirder and weirder, that it's more and more obvious to me the way that the scripts are operating everywhere. You know, they're operating in certain radical zones where it's just the same rant. They're operating in the middle brow or upper middle brow mainstream media where it's like, you know, watching the 180 degree shift of how Saudi Arabia is discussed in the mainstream. You know, like how it tries to turn on a dime and like everybody's exposed for all the kind of hypocrisy of it. You know, obviously a lot of the material coming from the right is like a kind of designed echo chamber, but also a lot of Democrat neoliberal, multicultural discourse as part of the mainstream side of it is also kind of, there's just everybody sort of like on script, and it's so alienating. And it feels like one of the things that everybody needs is a little more reflexivity, a little bit more awareness of how your ability to see the world you do the way you do is based on where you come from. And it doesn't mean that undermines the position. So what are the things about your past or even your current practice that have led you to see the world that you do? I mean, as I mentioned, you're unusual in that, you know, on the one hand, you could speak as a longtime burner, as somebody into a party scene, and you were like, you know, dope head in college and all, you used to have long dreads and you were kind of on that side. But at the same time, we can look and talk another thing that's about your political consciousness and the changes in that as you've moved through different positions on the left. What what are the kind of forces that really stay with you as the key contexts that through which you understand where you're coming from?
The emotional need that causes people to wear a mask so tightly that they don't remember how it feels to just have a face. Because when I was in college, I was very hungrily searching for someone to be. I didn't quite fit in. I didn't know where I belonged. My family was Puerto Rican, I don't speak Spanish. I mean, I'm learning now, but there was this kind of language limbo that I was in between worlds. I grew up Black, and at the same time, my family's from the islands. And I also was coming out of a school that was like a middle-class boarding school, but my family was working class. And then a lot of the students that were there were also working class because it was free. So a lot of us had this weird tension of being in this incredibly wealthy school, but going back to neighborhoods that were destroyed and families that were barely just getting by. And so when I got to college, I had all of these experiences: working class, middle class school, working class family, Latino background, but really growing up Black in the US. And then and so I remember when I first saw images of Bob Marley, because he's like around my skin complexion and he had the dreads. And I began to grow dreads as a form of masking. I needed some way to be seen. And the longer the dreads grew, they almost became like a veil that people saw the dreads before they could see me. And for a long time, that was very comforting because it gave me a persona that I could assume in public. And then the dreads also became like in a car wash, they became like a filter so that only people who I absolutely trusted could get through the dreads and inside to see who I really was. But then the dreads also served this other function, which is that they were like tree roots and that they tapped into a common diaspora Black freedom struggle, whether that was the independent movement in Puerto Rico, whether that was the Black freedom movement here in the United States or in Brazil, whether that was the anti-colonization movements in Africa or Jamaica or the Caribbean. And so I would go through New York, or I would go wherever I was, and the dreads were like these roots soaking up the stories of everyone who I met, whether they were friends, whether they were a family, whether they were strangers who I met on the street. And so all of these stories were soaking up through my dreads, kind of pulsing back into my brain. So I was constantly aware of the history of the freedom struggle and what life was like now versus this kind of American dream that was being advertised on all the screens and ads and movies and TVs and, radio spots. And so the dreads became a multi-purpose mask, both camouflage, armor, as well as a reflective light, as well as a roots. And then finally, when they grew and grew and grew, and then I was in New York and I had 9/11 and I still had the dreads. And then they smelled like the asbestos from the ground below zero. I mean, the ground zero. And all of that forced me to look at politics in a much more cryptic and suspicious or hermetic way. That politics often is a performance where people can find a mask to emotionally substitute or amplify or magnify a part of themselves that they're searching for. So sometimes politics is a way for people to find out who they think they want to be. Or politics is sometimes a way of people finding out who they think they've lost, in the past. And so I looked at politics in a much more kind of psychological and spiritual way as a meeting ground for oftentimes very confused people who were trying on a language the way that people who are disabled try on plastic limbs,
Yeah.
or the people in a theater try on mask. Now, that is a supplemental vision. Like, I mean, obviously politics has a very kind of practical side to it, which is people need to gather together to force their claim on the state or on the public opinion. So I'm not trying to demean that, but I'm saying my particular journey made me very, very cautious about the zealotry that happens in politics.
Yeah, really what's solid. I mean, I guess that's partly what I resonated with, because I have a similar tendency. It's very difficult for me not to kind of have a psychological radar going on when I'm dealing with people, most of the time anyway, but just specifically, in this context, when people are very, particularly when they're very forceful about their political position, I can't help but kind of look at the person as well. And that can be a way of avoiding what the claim is, the practical side of the politics. But that's not what you're doing or what we're really talking about either. It's just kind of expanding the scope, a bit. And I'm curious how much that side. I mean, I keep thinking about how to triangulate this conversation to talking more about Burning Man and some of the cultures that it represents. In terms of, one of the things you also call out is not just some of the zealotry you find in, communist circles or social justice movements or Occupy, but also the spiritual politics, if you will, of a lot of the kind of psychedelic Burning Man world, which very well. You've been, I think, 15 times or something, and it's very much, as you say, your family. That was a family gathering we had at that cool panel. And yet you have a very interesting way of both acknowledging the power and the value and the yumminess and the love of that kind of gathering. And at the same time, you have a very clear-eyed approach to its kind of political narratives or its transformative narratives. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that journey, kind of how you got into it a little bit, but also more, even as it serves such an important part of your life, how you're also very critical of aspects of it that I think a lot of other people are more easy just to go along with, because it's just a nice myth that, we're changing transformative culture, we're changing society, our celebration is, raising the vibration of the planet, and all the other various ways that people go about it. You're like, nah, I don't think so, but it's still very valuable. Yeah, so I'd like to hear how you balance those dimensions.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like Burning Man is like cultural appropriation gone good. It's like the best version of it. And what I mean by that is when I got to Burning Man, I've noticed that it was very kind of third world, very global South, very ethnic, very indigenous, very African, very Sari and Bindi and yoga, but it was almost all white. So it was weird. I've never been surrounded by so much ethnicity, but with no ethnic people at all, I mean, literally, it felt like the UN in the desert, but just like everyone was white. So, and so, I'd go and there was Hare Krishnas and, there was, people with, dreads and I took it, I took it in stride. I know what it was about. But the reason I say it's cultural appropriation gone right, or like, a good form of it, is that it's kind of like, the West has a very kind of binary way of looking, traditionally, of looking at the other, or the global South, or the third world. And so for the right wing, for the reactionary, it's like, oh, they're barbarian, they're genetically inferior, or their cultures is backward and primitive. Let's keep them walled off because we need to quarantine the West away from the contamination of the East or of the South. So that's a reactionary view, right? The West is the most human, evolved culture, reaching towards the stars with its satellites, reaching towards the dimensions with its science, and all the other cultures are just kind of sliding backwards. And then there's the liberal, progressive image of the other, which is the indigenous, the global South, third world actually has, it's like a noble savage image, or like a Rousseauian noble savage, where here is the truth of humanity that is innocent, and that we in the West have corrupted, and that if we want to rescue ourselves, we need to kind of return to nature. They're like the Ewoks in the Return of the Jedi. Like, we need to return to the native traditions, to the African, to the Indian. We need to return because, they have an answer. They're closer to the earth, right? And there's a certain kind of sense of like ahistorical patronizing in that as well, right? Because it totally ignores the complex humanity, good and bad, the complex politics and history, the good and bad of global South culture, third world culture. So there's that. But when I see people at Burning Man, wearing everything from the headdresses, which people I think are scapegoating in a maybe, disingenuous way, but because there's everywhere you go, like bindis and saris and dreadlocks, there's all forms of cultural appropriation. But when white people put on those masks or tokens of otherness, I think what they're doing is putting on a mask to magnify the parts of themselves that have actually been suppressed by their life in the suburban capitalist bourgeois West. Like, they've grown up in homes that were very stifling. They've grown up in suburbs that were safe but antiseptic. They grew up in homes where parents were absent because they were working too much. They grew up in a very disconnected and alienating culture where they were suckling at the teat of the mass media TV. Like, the TV was a nipple, and they were brain suckling. And their heads were filled with the toxic toxins of advertising, which is the propaganda arm of capitalism, which has nothing to do with your mental health and everything to do to program you to consume. And so they were literally buying bits and pieces of personality from the store shelves, and then being vicious upon each other at school, bullying each other at school or college or at the workplace, if you didn't, have the right, price tag on you, to the point where people who are poor and homeless are invisible because they don't even have a price tag. They're just dying in the street. So in that context, I can see why people would come to Burning Man to get away exactly from the world that created them. They grew up in a world of alienation. What's secure? Let's go to a place where you have to participate and no one is denied.
Yeah.
You've grown up in a world where you can't express how you really feel because you might be seen as weird or need medicine, psychotropic medicine, or they need therapy. Well, go to Burning Man. Radical self-expression. You can be as weird and crazy as you want, and people celebrate it. You grew up in a world where you couldn't touch very much. You go to Burning Man, everyone's hugging and kissing, and there's even sex out in the open sometimes. You grew up in a world of capitalism, which alienated you from your desires and your labor. What do? You go to Burning Man. There's no money. Everyone's gift giving. So Burning Man is the exact kind of positive solar light eclipse opposite of a lot of where people who go to Burning Man grew up in. It's how they cured themselves. And of course, if they grew up in suburbs or grew up in places where there weren't many people of color or wasn't a lot of cultural diversity, they go to Burning Man, and what do? They adopt the kind of tokens of otherness as a way of reconnecting with the other inside of themselves, So, of course, they probably know a lot about indigenous traditions, and they're probably, a lot of them are almost like near PhD scholars in this or that tradition. But I think they're doing that too often as a way of finding themselves through the pathway of the other, right? Rather than it's really about kind of this kind of political solidarity with, with people outside of our in-group.
Yeah.
So, I would say, and that's what I think cultural appropriation that's gone well is because all cultures are formed by appropriating bits and pieces from other cultures. There's very few instances where something is just created out of whole cloth magically. And and it's not really appropriation in the sense that people are making money off of this at Burning Man. It's just that instead of making money, they're actually making themselves, right? And so it's probably the most healing form of cultural theft that you can imagine.
That's a great way of putting it. One of the things you talked about on the panel was you contrasted three different kinds of festivals, and it was I think a really, in a way, a basic point, but it's not said enough. and that is that if you go to a Trump rally and you got the guys with the MAGA hats and the whole thing, and they're pumping their fists and whatever, it's a different vibe than a big dance floor on the Esplanade, but it's not a fundamentally different thing. And that the festival has a reactionary form, and then it has what you also describe as a revolutionary form, a radical form, with Occupy being the kind of the great recent example, with Burning Man being somewhere in the middle, something you call like a status quo event, where you can go and it does change, does heal. There is a kind of partial utopian space opened up temporarily, but in a way that's all you're going to get out of the thing. Are there ways, and then at the same time, though, and this is what I like to hear you talk about, a lot of people who are in that status quo world, whether it's Burning Man or other kind of transformational festivals, have a lot of ideas about how this transformation is happening. And while you're sympathetic with some of the reasons they're there and some of the experiences that they are transformed by, you see some real blindness is there as well. And I just like to hear you, or in a way articulate about some of the traps you think some of the festival culture people are getting into in terms of a kind of political naivete or a kind of, lack of critical self-awareness around ideas that possibly could be improved and made more powerful in the world if certain other ideas are overcome.
The idea that everyone's welcome and everyone can come. Part of the appeal of Burning Man is that it's an open place. Its openness is part of its moral justification. That's how the community justifies, in many ways, what from the outside world could be seen as very sophisticated hedonism, perversion, hubris, almost heresy in art. Like a lot of the sacred icons are definitely trashed at Burning Man. You see that? And so because Burning Man is like an example of what happens in other festivals, but it really comes to a high point at Burning Man, is that because it challenges so many of the norms of the outside society, it then in some ways needs a moral justification. And that moral justification in part is that, well, we're open. Everyone is, and I forget, it's one of the 10 principles. Which one is like, everyone can come in.
Yeah, inclusivity, I think. I can't
Radical
remember.
inclusion.
Yeah.
But but it's actually not. And one of the ways it functions is it's actually radically exclusive. I mean, come on, like you can't call an event that's like $440 and it takes like $1,000 other bucks to get like water, food, and like all the expenses of building these huge, things. And then traveling to like, for me, like 2,400 miles and then driving another couple of 100 miles to the desert and then be like, well, we're really inclusive. Like, how are you inclusive? You're in the middle of a desert that is like that has, it's like the surface of the sun and it's like way far out there. I mean, it's where they bury nuclear waste and alien bodies. Like, you're not inclusive, but it's part of its moral justification, The other thing is radical expression. And that's true. It's there's a lot of radical expression. And there's a fun, perverse playfulness that I really appreciate. There's a lot of vulgarness that I love at Burning Man. But there's also these invisible red lines that people don't seem to cross. That like sexuality isn't as open as maybe it should be. especially in some of the art. Politics are kind of foreclosed there because people don't want to disagree about politics. They want to keep a good vibe. And, you know, certain kinds of, I would say, gothic or even nightmarish or like Halloween-esque, you know, imagery where it's about, you know, dismemberment or blood. Like there's a whole tradition about the breaking down of the human body and nightmare ghoulish images. You don't really see that at Burning Man, right? Everything's kind of fluffy. You know, it's kind of like nice, and it's about keeping a positive vibe. So there's a certain kind of unspoken aesthetic, you know, red line that people don't cross because they want to keep the good vibe. The other is just the privilege that shields the event. You know, in a certain way, Nevada pays off the surrounding authorities, you know, with a huge, I mean, not like a direct payoff. It's not like a Scorsese films where they're just like handing wads of cash to the cops, you know, although that would be a great breaking story. But it's just more that everyone knows that Burning Man brings in gas money. They buy tons of food, tons of water, tons of supplies. They have storage in Reno. And so, you know, no one wants Burning Man to go because it brings a lot to the city. And so, you know, there's a kind of class kind of scratching of each other's back. You know, everyone knows that tons of drugs are done at Burning Man, but you don't see, you know, SEAL Team 6 dropping out of a helicopter and rounding up, you know, people using drugs because they know they want the event to keep going. So there's a certain amount of class privilege there. And then there's also a certain amount of racial privilege. I mean, I just do the mental experiment. If Burning Man was black, you know, if it's just like all black people gathering in the desert, like would they be, you know, would the cops just be like, oh, sure, have a good time. Hey, you know what? I have an old KKK outfit in my attic from my grandfather. Maybe you want to burn that too. Like, of course they wouldn't. Like, so I think there's just a lot of unspoken things that don't really fit the narrative, that are part of the unspoken infrastructure that actually keeps Burning Man going and what it is. And in some ways, especially like the separation in the desert, I think in some ways the fact that it's separate and it's temporary adds to the dreamlike effect. If it was permanent, then it would start getting messy and political. So it's exactly because it's in the Salvador Dali painting of a desert and the clock is ticking as soon as you get there, that it adds to this fierce, lucid dreaming effect of the playa.
Absolutely.
And I think that wouldn't exist any other way. So It is what it is. But I think, you know, a certain sense of irony and humor about Burning Man maybe help pops the bubble on a little of the kind of pretentious. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think the level of pretentiousness that sometimes exists on the playa, not always. You know, there's the orgy dome, you know, there's the disabled walk and run, you know, literally disabled people like with their wheelchairs and plastic figurines being dragged behind them. Like that was awesome. There's the rabbit march on the man, you know, I mean, it's great. And I think that those things help pop the bubble of pretentiousness, right? But I think the level of pretentiousness at Burning Man goes up to the degree that people forget the infrastructure of privilege that allows for that bubble to inflate into this beautiful, luminescent, you know, rainbow, oily quality that it has in the desert before it pops in 7 days, you know?
Yeah, no, well said. I was particularly thinking about one, you know, issue that's interesting about race and particularly not just the festival culture, although it, you know, I'd like to hear you talk about the experience of being a person of color on the playa, and I know you helped found a camp, and it's always something that I've been very aware of. I lived in New York for a long time, and I'm used to a pretty multi-hued social environment, and so I was always very kind of aware of that in the many years that I was at Burning Man, but and had some good conversations about it over the years. That I always like, you know, step up and ask people about their experiences and how it works. And then you also, as I mentioned, wrote that article that appeared in the MAPS bulletin about psychedelics and race. And one of the things that I wanted to ask about your impression is that, you know, there's a you know, kind of sort of a liberal progressive drive for diversity. So if you're going to have a panel on psychedelics, you don't want to have the same old white guys. We're sick of hearing about the white guys. And then, there's a lot of people other folks who can speak, and a lot of, more, some people show up, but everybody would love more, I think not everybody, but a lot of us would love more diversity. But there are also things that aren't just about the way that privilege and education and institutions already have certain barriers set up. There's also some things, and this is what I want to ask you about. You write a little bit about it in your book, where there are resistances to psychedelic culture within, communities of color, partly based on just the perception of drug culture, partly a way that drugs are treated differently historically in these groups, partly out of a political suspicion against their meaning. And as somebody who's, a psychedelic and political person of color, how do you see that tension? Is it a tension? Is there are there aspects of that also could come into play in order to really genuinely diversify the larger conversation about psychedelics, not necessarily just festival culture? In the end of the day, I don't know how many people of color really want to spend their time at Burning Man, because they're like, what? It's all this fucking white people like doing all that thing, whatever. Like I've heard a lot of people pull that down. But looking broader into the sort of more general, like transformative psychedelic culture, what are some productive ways to take it to another level?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have been the beneficiary of a surprising, but also, to be honest, a kind of unwanted tokenism, in that the psychedelic kind of enchanted core of the counterculture has kind of been caught with its pants down in terms of diversity. Because in one way, the counterculture is, bursting at the seams with visions of tomorrow and inner visions from its psychedelic trips, and kind of perceives through the veils of time what society could be. And at the same time, because of how the counterculture was formed in the United States, everything from the beatniks in the West Coast and in New York, and then morphing in the 60s with the kind of generational rebellion against the Cold War generation, and kind of culminating in the be-ins of the 1968, you really had, it was kind of a white middle class rebellion against their parents, who were traumatized by World War II and came back from the war alcoholic and with shell shock, or their moms were shell shocked from having jobs and then being thrown out by the men who came back. And then, these really dysfunctional families. And so, but yet they grew up in this great material wealth of post-World War II. America was the only economy really functioning. Everything else was blasted apart by bombs. So you had this 1960s generation, who was mostly white and middle class, rebelling and creating these kind of enclaves. And then what happened is that the segregation that happened, that was formative for that generation, basically just stayed. There wasn't it doesn't seem like there was this great integration that happened, and so, when I go into the circles, I see wealthy white liberals who are in some ways either directly from that 60s, 70s generation or the children of it. And, I happen to be in that circle because I was invited in by a kind of a really cool West Coast tribe of people in the Bay Area who are almost all people of color and who just knew about Burning Man, and they invited me in. I had no idea what it was about. And when I got in there, I stayed at Burning Man for 15 years, and I'll always go back for as long as I can, because it really healed a culture, a spiritual need that I had that was very specific to me. If 9/11 hadn't happened in New York, and if I wasn't there, I may have not gone back to Burning Man. But I kept going back because I had soaked into my body a lot of anxiety and terror from either 9/11 or from reporting from Darfur or reporting from Hurricane Katrina's New Orleans. And I needed a place to pour that anxiety into. And the desert was this huge sponge that I could pour all that anxiety into. So I had a very specific connection to Burning Man that wasn't really about the parties. It was about, the spiritual energy, the crackling mystery that happens in the playa. So all that to say is that, I'm there. So of course I make friendships. And through those friendships, people then kind of catapulted me into a position of like, hey, do you want to speak here? Do you want to speak there? And so I find myself, at these panels or conferences, and because I'm a literature professor, and because I'm an activist, and because I've done psychedelics, and I do, that I kind of fit that moment. I fit what they need. So I'm the perfect profile of it. But it's still, to be honest, it kind of feels like tokenism. It feels like I'm being brought into a pre-existing space, so that people can hear a different point of view, but also so that it looks diverse. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And for me, the reason I say tokenism is because when it's an organic community, it's people kind of know each other because they've lived with each other. They have relationships with each other. And they've married with each other, they have kids with each other, they've tripped and journeyed together, and so it's not like you're just being brought in, from the outside, which I should be careful. Like I'm in the inside, and I have relationships with people, so it is more organic for me. But the larger question of diversity is that it actually just takes time for people to actually be inside, and not only invited, but also like, well, how does this place become relevant for a new generation, say, of millennial youth of color, who I would say really need the ceremonies in these spaces and really need the lessons, say, on polyamory or psychedelic living, because I think that these values are actually make life a little bit easier, because they encourage you to figure out what your desires really are. And there's a lot of millennial youth of color, who are literally lost and abandoned and are trying to find themselves in the maze of the cities and in the streets. And they have conservative families sometimes who don't really understand them, or they have very violent neighborhoods that don't understand them. And they're just trying to figure out how to live. And I think that a lot of these life lessons are right there in the psychedelic community, or in this kind of like hippie counterculture community. But there's really not much of a bridge between them, So I guess I'll end by saying this. I think that diversity shouldn't be about saving the ass or the reputation or the face of the kind of wealthy white liberal communities, bringing in, indigenous or people like me of color as a kind of tokens, but really saying we don't need to be saved. What we need to do is that we have experiences, ceremonies, and lessons. Why don't we bring in youth of color who are just starting out on their life and show them that there are so many different models to living, and we can offer you can take it if you want or leave it, but at least here are ways that you can live that may make it easier for you to feel at home in your body, and that kind of relationship. And then what you do is you wind up recruiting a really new, powerful, vibrant, energetic generation, who it's more of a giving and taking, rather than kind of taking a paintbrush of color and daubing it on the advertising for the next conference.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a very interesting conversation with this fellow from Detroit, named Madhu, who was traveling with Kilindi, who's this very interesting character also from Detroit, who's become a figure on the psychedelic scene, holding down a very intense, heroic dose approach to psychedelia that's pretty intense. And he's got a very fascinating, very far out rap. And Madhu is one of his a fellow who's worked with him and who is very convinced of the value for, MDMA and more classic psychedelics for people in the ghetto, working with the enormous stresses and all the inherited trauma and all the grief and claustrophobia of that condition. And one of the things he was talking about, though, is that a lot of people that he's sort of like, hey, you might want to check this out. That people are they associate it with a kind of, with just, craziness, with just being crazy or being out of control. And he was talking about how interesting it was that when, to try to like reshape what these things meant, and that it was kind of frustrating for him. He was clearly kind of frustrated with it. So there's all of these weird blocks, and as you speak, I'm trying to imagine what these alternatives might look like in terms of creating spaces and environments and invitations that aren't just token and aren't just making people feel better, but getting down into the grittiness. And one of the things that I always think about in terms of the 60s, because psychedelics in the white counterculture, whether it's more druggy or more political, was really pervasive. And then in black struggles, it's very hit and miss. Like some people are really opposed to it, some people are kind of down with it. But for every, in the George Clinton mothership connection kind of exuberance, there were people who were really resistant to it. And I think it's partly that it gets back to that privilege thing. White people, and particularly white men, can afford to, quote unquote, go crazy. I can go crazy, write a memoir of the craziness that I went through, act crazy at a street lamp, but I'm covered, I'm good. But for somebody of color to go crazy, that's a whole other ballgame. Like the way that systems control what that means. Because in some ways, psychedelics is letting yourself get a little crazy, a little bit unmoored, out of control in an environment where you don't know what's going to happen. And so it's also about building.
Well, yeah, there's a good. Yeah, well, it gets back to the theme of the mask, because one of the ways that people of color in poor neighborhoods, whether it's Latinos in the Bronx, Boricuas in the Bronx, Caribbean folks here in Bed-Stuy, African Americans in Harlem, and then Spanish Harlem. I mean, like whatever it is, that there's like a mask of toughness. And Elijah Anderson, I believe his name is, has a really good article, and it's also a book called The Code of the Streets, and talked about how young men and women, but specifically young men, have to perform a mask of toughness because they don't want to be seen as an easy mark. They don't want to be seen as a pussy, someone being shoved around, or you're a bitch, or I can step on your shoes, I can shove you, I can, take anything I want from you, and especially your respect. And so they have to wear it's like a mask. And then on top of that, there's then the other mask of when you step out of that neighborhood and you go into, predominantly white spaces, there is a lot of judgment. Oh, does this person talk hood, act hood? Or even if you're not, say you're coming from a middle-class Black neighborhood or Latino neighborhood, and you've gone to your Brown University schools, or you've gone to your Emerson, and you come out and you're cool, but there's still that way of looking, and so you wear a mask to try to hide both your own inner anxiety, your own fear, and it's like a protective mask. And so the thing with psychedelics is that psychedelics melt mask away. The psychedelics melt the ego mask, whether you wear it for others or you wear it for yourself. And so for a person whose survival depends on that mask, the idea of something that could melted and leave you vulnerable around people you don't know you can trust is terrifying. And then finally, there has been a history of white supremacist institutions, whether it's the plantation owners giving lots of alcohol to his slaves, whether it's cops or the mafia looking the other way as heroin floods the nightclubs, the black nightclubs of the 50s. And you have amazing musicians, John Coltrane's friends, or Billie Holiday, who are on the needle, on heroin. You have the drug epidemic, the crack epidemic of the 80s and early 90s, and then, you talk about, well, how did the crack get here? So there's been a deep, long suspicion of drugs in the community because they've always been seen. They've always been seen as elements that are destructive to Black America rather than liberating of.
I should have introduced
and I think,
True earlier.
Oh, yeah.
You're a child.
Hey, you want to say something to the people there? Hey, True, you want to say something? Yeah. Oh, hold on. Let me see if we can get your baby laugh.
That'd be good.
Hey, kissy baby. Kissy baby.
That's great.
Yeah, you want to say hi to people? Okay. All right.
Well, we got about a minute left here, so I just want to let you finish that thought. If you have
well, just for white people. I'm sorry, that's a really lazy way of saying it. I think for whites in the counterculture who had a certain measure of class privilege, psychedelics was introduced and used and seen primarily as a means of liberating oneself from the material world, from a very materialist United States, from liberating oneself from capitalism. And that kind of counterculture narrative, and of course, there's some people who succeeded at it, some people who failed at it, but there was at least that revolutionary idea. But that was never really the experience for people of color.
Yeah.
Latinos getting busted and thrown in jail for years over marijuana. The Mexican weed rapist, which one of the first kind of uses of that idea of the Mexican rapist, like, oh, they're on weed. And this goes back, generations.
Yeah.
I'm
afraid we're going to have to. We totally keep talking. I know we're just going to keep on rolling. But we do have to end it here. So I wanted to thank you for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. Nicholas Powers, once again, author of The Ground Below Zero. It's a wonderful collection, and if you go to his website, which I'll put a link to, you can catch up with his more recent journalism and poetry and work. So thanks again. And until next week, folks, keep your minds open.